The morning Jacob Hadley cracked open his dead father's strongbox and found a land deed that did not belong to his family. The entire course of his life changed before he could even finish his first cup of coffee. It was the autumn of 1882, deep in the hill country of central Texas, where the cedar trees smelled like something holy and the wind came down from the north with a bite that promised a hard winter ahead. Jacob had been putting off going through his father's belongings for 3 weeks now, ever since Elias Hadley had gone to his grave on a Tuesday afternoon without much ceremony and even less explanation for the tangle of affairs he left behind. The old man had not been kind in life, and he had not been tidy in death, and Jacob had already spent the better part of 2 weeks sorting through debts and receipts and the kind of paperwork that made a man feel like his father had been a stranger wearing a familiar face. The strongbox was heavy, iron-banded and rusted at the hinges, and it had taken Jacob the better part of an hour to locate the key among his father's effects. When he finally got it open on the kitchen table, with the morning light coming sideways through the single window and a mug of black coffee going cold at his elbow, he expected to find the usual business of a man like Elias Hadley. Bank notes, maybe. The deed to the Hadley property. Perhaps a record of loans given or taken. He found all of those things, and he found something else. Tucked beneath a bundle of correspondence tied with twine, pressed flat and careful between 2 pieces of stiff cardboard as though someone had taken deliberate pains to preserve it, was a land deed. Jacob pulled it out slowly, holding it up to the light. The paper was good quality, heavy stock, the kind used by county offices and land registrars. It was dated March 14, 1879, and it recorded the legal transfer of 160 acres in Calhoun County to a woman named Celia Carter, described as the sole heir of one Thomas Carter, deceased, of Beaumont, Texas. Jacob read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and stared at it the way a man stares at something that does not make sense but is plainly, undeniably real. His father had no business having this document. The Hadley land was in Travis County, 150 miles from Calhoun. Elias Hadley had never, to Jacob's knowledge, had any dealings in that part of Texas. And yet here was this deed, carefully preserved, hidden beneath everything else, as though the old man had known exactly what it was and exactly why he did not want anyone finding it. Jacob turned the deed over in his hands. On the back, in handwriting that was not his father's, someone had written a name and an address. Mrs. Celia Carter, Sparrow Creek, Calhoun County, Texas. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, his horses moved in the corral, and the cedar jays argued in the trees, and the Texas morning did what Texas mornings do in October, which is get more beautiful and more relentless at the same time. Jacob Hadley was 26 years old and broad-shouldered, and not given to impulsive decisions. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke and measured before he cut, and did not generally act on gut feelings. But sitting there at his father's kitchen table with that deed in his hands, looking at the name Celia Carter written in a careful, hopeful script, he felt something settle into place in his chest like a stone dropping into still water. He did not know this woman. He did not know what his father had done, or why this deed was here, or whether the woman named Celia Carter even knew it was missing. But he knew, with the simple clarity of a man who has spent his life outdoors and learned to read the sky for what it truly is, that this document did not belong to Elias Hadley. It belonged to her. And whatever his father had done or not done, Jacob Hadley was not going to be the man who let that stand. He folded the deed carefully into the cardboard again and wrapped it in an oilcloth from the kitchen drawer. Then he went to the corral, saddled his best horse, a big roan gelding named Captain that stood 16 hands and could cover ground all day without complaint, packed enough for 3 days' hard riding, and left his father's house behind him. The ride from Travis County to Calhoun County was not a short one under any circumstances, and Jacob did not take a direct route because there was no direct route to be taken. The land between those 2 places was a rolling, complicated territory of limestone ridges and river crossings and small towns that sprang up along the stage roads like wildflowers after rain, here one year and gone the next. Jacob had made similar rides before, trailing cattle and doing his father's business, and he knew the land well enough to read it rather than fight it. The first day he rode south and east through the hill country, crossing the Pedernales River at a shallow ford where the water ran cold and clear over white limestone. He made good time in the morning while the air was cool, pushing Captain to a steady ground-eating trot that the roan could hold for hours. By midday the sun was high and the country had begun to flatten into the coastal plain, and Jacob let the horse walk and ate jerked beef from his saddlebag and thought about what he was going to say when he found this woman. What do you say to someone whose deed your dead father stole? He did not know for certain that his father had stolen it. He reminded himself. There could be an explanation. Elias Hadley might have been holding it for safekeeping, or purchased it legally, or found it and intended to return it himself. But even as Jacob constructed these possibilities, he did not believe any of them. He had known his father. He knew the way the old man operated, quiet and certain, and always tilted toward his own advantage. He had seen Elias Hadley take things that were not his before. Not in grand ways, not in ways that invited prosecution, but in small, steady ways that accumulated over a lifetime into something larger and darker than any single incident suggested. He made camp that first night beside a creek that had no name on any map he knew of, hobbling Captain in a patch of good grass and building a small fire against the October chill. He ate beans heated in the can and listened to the coyotes talking somewhere out in the dark, and did not sleep particularly well, which was not unusual for him. He was a light sleeper by nature, had been since boyhood, and the nights away from his own bed always brought a particular kind of wakefulness that was not quite peaceful but was not unpleasant either. He lay on his bedroll and watched the stars wheel overhead and thought about land. Land was everything out here. That was the plain truth of this country and this time, and no one who lived in Texas in 1882 was ignorant of it. The great drives were winding down as the railheads moved and the ranges shrank, but the land itself remained the fundamental currency of a man's dignity and a woman's survival. 160 acres in Calhoun County, with good water and the right soil, could be a life. It could be a livelihood. It could be the difference between a woman who owned her own ground and stood in her own door and looked out at her own horizon, and a woman who depended on the goodwill of someone else for every meal and every roof over her head. What had his father done, keeping this from her? And for how long? He fell asleep eventually and dreamed of nothing in particular and woke before dawn to saddle Captain and ride. The second day was harder. The country east of San Antonio grew flat and marshy in places, and the road, such as it was, turned muddy in the low areas where the drainage was poor. Captain picked his way through carefully, and Jacob did not push him. They stopped at noon in a town called Hallettsville, where Jacob paid 15 cents for a meal at a boarding house, run by a stout German woman who told him without being asked that she had come to Texas 20 years ago, and had never once regretted it, which Jacob found both admirable and a little sad. He asked her if she knew anything about Sparrow Creek in Calhoun County. She knew it, she said. Small settlement, maybe 40 people, down near the coast where the land was black and rich and the mosquitoes were as large as small birds. She said it without irony as a statement of geographical fact. Jacob thanked her and rode on. By late afternoon the air had changed. He could smell the coast on it, that thick saltan mud smell that the Gulf of Mexico pushed inland on the southerly breeze. And the vegetation had changed too, the cedar and live oak giving way to coastal grasses and cattail marshes and the occasional towering palmetto. It was beautiful country in a low and serious way, the kind of landscape that did not announce itself but simply was, patient and consequential. He made camp that second night in a stand of live oaks just off the road, and this time he slept better, lulled by the sound of frogs in a nearby marsh and the knowledge that he was getting close. By his reckoning, Sparrow Creek was no more than 15 or 16 miles farther east, and he would reach it comfortably by mid-morning if he started early. He started very early. The morning was gray and cool, with a mist coming in off the coastal flats that softened everything to watercolor. Captain moved through it quietly, his hooves whispering in the damp grass at the road's edge. Jacob could see no more than 100 yards in any direction, but he did not need to see farther. He knew he was going the right way. Sparrow Creek announced itself with a church steeple appearing out of the mist like a finger pointing at heaven, followed shortly by the rooflines of perhaps a dozen buildings strung along a single main street. It was a small place, smaller than Hallettsville by half, the kind of town that existed because the land around it required services, and because human beings are, at their core, creatures who need a general store and a post office, and a place to have a conversation with someone other than their own livestock. Jacob rode in slowly, attracting the attention of a dog that emerged from under a porch and then thought better of it, and a man in a leather apron who was opening the door of a blacksmith's shop and who watched Jacob ride past with the mild curiosity of a man who has seen enough strangers to know that most of them are harmless. Jacob reined up in front of the general store. A bell jangled when he pushed through the door, and a boy of about 12 appeared from behind a counter stacked with bolts of cloth and bins of dried goods and looked at him with open assessment. "Morning," Jacob said. "I'm looking for a property that would belong to a woman named Celia Carter. Could you point me in the right direction?" The boy's expression shifted, became less commercial and more guarded. "Miss Carter's place is about 2 miles east," he said. "You follow this road out and you'll see her lane on the left. There's a gate made of cedar posts." "Much obliged," Jacob said. He bought a bag of peppermints from the boy, more out of gratitude than hunger, and went back out into the mist. He found the cedar post gate exactly where the boy had said it would be. The lane beyond it was rutted but maintained, with the grass cut back on either side to keep the way clear. It ran perhaps a quarter-mile through a field of what had recently been corn, the stalks still standing but stripped and brown now in the October cold, and then curved around a stand of trees and opened onto a farmstead. Jacob pulled Captain up and looked at what was there. The house was modest but solid, built of lumber rather than log, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, and a pair of windows on either side of the door that caught what morning light was filtering through the mist. There was a kitchen garden to one side, neatly put to bed for the season, and a barn behind the house that looked as though it had been recently repaired, the new lumber bright against the weathered old. There were chickens and a milk cow in a small pasture, and a kitchen garden that someone had clearly worked hard to build and maintain. But something was off, and Jacob could see it even from the gate. The fence along the near pasture had been partially torn down, 3 or 4 sections of it, and not by any natural cause. The posts had been pulled, not broken, and they lay in a ragged pile like something discarded. Near the barn, a stack of firewood that someone had clearly spent effort splitting and stacking had been scattered and kicked apart. And on the porch itself, painted in red letters across the boards of the front wall, were the words "Get Out." Jacob sat very still on Captain for a moment. Then he dismounted, looped the reins around the cedar gate post, and walked up the lane toward the house. He was halfway up when the front door opened, and a woman appeared on the porch with a shotgun in her hands, and Jacob stopped walking. She was not what he had imagined, and he had not exactly imagined her, but the reality of her was striking enough that his thoughts went momentarily sideways. She was perhaps 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pulled back and a few pieces of it coming loose around her face, and her eyes were the precise dark gray of the coastal sky above her head. She was wearing a work dress of faded blue cotton with an apron over it, and she held that shotgun with the ease of a woman who had held one before and knew what it was for. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was level, not frightened, which told Jacob something important about her character. "My name is Jacob Hadley," he said, keeping his hands visible and his voice easy. "I rode from Travis County. I'm not here to cause you any trouble, ma'am. I have something that belongs to you." She did not lower the gun. "Jacob Hadley." She said his name like she was testing its weight. "I don't know any Jacob Hadley." "No, ma'am, you wouldn't. I didn't know you either until 3 days ago. My father was Elias Hadley, out of Travis County. He passed 3 weeks back, and when I was going through his things, I found a document that has your name on it." He reached slowly into his coat and drew out the oilcloth packet. "I believe it's the deed to this property." Something happened to her face then. The controlled, watchful expression cracked just a little, and underneath it Jacob could see something raw and urgent and barely held together. But the gun did not waver. "Show me," she said. He unfolded the oilcloth slowly and held the deed out at arm's length, far enough that she could see it from the porch without coming closer. She looked at it for a long moment, and he watched her chest rise and fall with a breath that was not quite steady. "Come up on the porch," she said at last, slowly. He came up the porch steps with deliberate care, and she stepped back to give him room, keeping the shotgun angled. He held the deed out to her. She looked at it, her hands dropping to her sides, the shotgun pointed at the porch boards now, forgotten as she read what was written on that paper. She read it the way he had read it twice, and then once more. When she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with something he recognized as a person not crying only by the force of their own determination. "Where did you find this?" she said. "In a locked strongbox," Jacob said. "My father's, hidden under other papers like someone put it there on purpose." He paused. "I don't know exactly what happened, Miss Carter. I don't know how he came to have it, but I know it belongs to you, and I thought you ought to have it back." She was very quiet for a moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She lowered herself onto the porch steps and pressed the deed against her chest with both hands, and she closed her eyes and she breathed. Jacob stood on the porch above her and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was more important than letting her have that moment. After a while she opened her eyes and looked up at him and said, "My father bought this land in 1876 when we came out from Mississippi. He built everything you see here. When he died in 1879, the county registered the deed in my name." She paused. 3 months later, a man came and told me the deed had errors in the registration, that there were problems with the title, and that I would need to surrender the original while the county sorted it out. He said he would bring it back within the month. She looked at the deed in her hands. He never brought it back, and 2 years ago someone started trying to run me off, tearing down fences, threatening letters. Last month they painted that. She nodded toward the wall behind her. "Who is the man who took the deed?" Jacob said. "He told me his name was Rufus Cole," she said. "He said he represented a land company out of Houston. I have since come to believe that was not entirely true." She looked at Jacob with those gray eyes that were steady and serious and direct. "Was your father involved with anyone named Rufus Cole?" Jacob's jaw tightened. He thought of the correspondence tied with twine in the strongbox. He had not read all of it, but he had seen a name on one of the envelopes. "I believe he may have been," he said. "I need to look at some papers I left at my father's house. But Miss Carter, I want you to know that what was done to you was wrong, and I intend to help you set it right if you'll permit me." She looked at him for a long time. The mist was lifting now, burning off as the sun climbed, and the light was beginning to come through the live oak trees at the edge of her property in long golden shafts that made the whole place look like something out of a painting. The chickens scratched in the yard. The milk cow lowed somewhere behind the barn. The morning was very quiet. "You rode 3 days to bring me this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He thought about how to answer that. "Because it was yours," he said. "And because what my father did, if he did what I think he did, is the kind of thing that a man ought to try to make right if he can. I can't undo what he did. But I can bring you your deed." She studied him another long moment. Then she stood up from the porch steps and held out her hand, and he shook it, and her grip was firm and dry and businesslike. "I'm Celia Carter," she said, as though they had not already established that. "You'd better come inside and have some coffee. You look like you've been riding for 3 days." "I have," he said. "Well then," she said, and opened the door. The inside of the house was neat and efficiently arranged, the kind of interior that speaks not of luxury, but of careful management of limited resources. There was a good iron stove against one wall with a wood box beside it, and a table with 4 chairs and shelves holding the practical inventory of a woman who did her own canning and preserving. There were also 2 things that surprised him: a bookshelf with a genuine collection of volumes and a framed sampler on the wall done in careful cross-stitch that read simply, "This ground is mine." He noticed her watching him notice the sampler. "My mother made that," she said, "before she passed." She was quite clear about what mattered. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and then sat across the table, and they looked at each other in the way that 2 strangers look at each other, when circumstances have put them into a position of sudden, unexpected intimacy, without the usual social scaffolding to make it comfortable. "Tell me everything you know about your father and Rufus Cole," she said. So he did. He told her about finding the Strongbox, about the deed, about the correspondence he had seen. He told her about Elias Hadley in the plain terms that a man uses when he has stopped lying to himself about who his father was. He said that Elias had been a man of business in the worst sense, meaning a man who saw every transaction as an opportunity and every other person's difficulty as an advantage to be pressed. He said he had not understood the full scope of it until after the old man was dead, and that he was not asking for her sympathy, only giving her an honest account. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face, and she did not interrupt him. "There is also the matter of the men who have been pressuring you," he said when he was done. "Tearing down your fences and painting on your wall, that's not just a legal problem." "No," she agreed. "It's become more than that." She was quiet a moment. "I went to the county sheriff last month. He told me there was nothing he could do without more evidence, and that if I felt unsafe, I should consider relocating." She said it without expression, but the contempt in her voice was clear and measured. He did not seem troubled by the suggestion that a woman should simply abandon her dead father's land because someone painted a threat on her wall. "Who else knows about your situation?" "My neighbor Tom Aldridge, about 3 miles north. He's been keeping an eye out. And Reverend Marsh at the church in town. He knows some of what's happened." She paused. "Most people in Sparrow Creek know me and know the situation, but there is only so much that neighbors can do when the trouble has a legal appearance to it. If someone believed they had a valid claim to this land, and if the original deed was missing so there was nothing to prove them wrong." She let that trail off, and Jacob finished the thought silently. Without the deed, she was vulnerable. With the deed, she had something solid to stand on. It was remarkable, really, how much power a single piece of paper could carry, and how thoroughly some men understood that power and used it. "We need to get this registered properly," Jacob said. "And we need to do it in a way that's on record in a place where it can't be tampered with. Do you know a lawyer?" She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of a smile if circumstances had been less tense. "I know of a lawyer in Victoria, Mr. Samuel Prout. He has a reputation for being honest, which in this part of Texas is worth mentioning specifically." "Then that's where we start," Jacob said. He had not planned to stay. He had told himself, riding down here, that he would deliver the deed and ride home, that his obligation was discharged with the delivery, and that whatever came after was not his affair. He understood now, sitting in Celia Carter's kitchen with the morning light coming through her windows and the red painted letters visible through the glass on her porch wall, that this was not going to be as simple as a delivery. But he found to his own mild surprise that he did not mind. "I can stay a few days," he said, "if it would be useful. I can help repair that fence, and I can ride to Victoria with you to see the lawyer if you'd like company." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that?" "You've already done more than anyone could have asked." "Because those fences need fixing," he said, and again he thought he saw the beginning of that smile. "There's a barn," she said. I have an extra horse blanket. It's not luxurious. I've been sleeping on the ground for 3 nights, he said. A barn sounds fine. She gave him a genuine smile then, brief and a little reluctant, as though she had gotten out of the habit of smiling freely and had to remind herself that it was permissible. All right, Jacob Hadley, she said. You can stay. He spent that afternoon fixing her fence. He found the cedar posts in the pile where they had been thrown, and dug new holes with the iron digger from her barn, and set the posts solid and strung the wire tight. It was good plain work, the kind he knew and was comfortable with, and the physical labor of it settled something in him that had been unsettled since he opened that strongbox. She brought him water in the middle of the afternoon and stood in the field while he drank it and watched her corn stubble as though reading something in it. I need to break that field again in spring, she said. I was hoping to get a second crop in before winter, but things have been complicated this year. What happened to your farmhand? He asked. The neat state of the kitchen garden and the repaired barn told him this place had once had more labor working it than a single woman. She looked at him. His name was Pedro. He worked for me for 2 years. In March, 2 men came to the farm and told him that if he kept working for me, they would report him to the Texas Rangers as an illegal. He left the next day. I couldn't blame him. Her voice was even, but there was anger underneath it, banked and controlled. They worked at this from every angle they could. Jacob understood then the scope of what had been done to her. Not just the deed, not just the painted wall and the torn fences. A systematic campaign to isolate her, deprive her of help, wear down her resources, until she had nothing left to fight with and no one to stand beside her. And it had been going on for years. He drove the last fence post with more force than was strictly necessary. You've held on through all of this, he said. This is my father's land, she said simply. This is mine. I was not going to leave. That evening she cooked supper, a proper one, with cornbread and beans and salt pork, and a dried apple pie that was better than anything Jacob had eaten in months. And they sat at the table and talked with the easy, circling conversation of 2 people who are trying to know each other without appearing to try too hard. He learned that she had come to Texas as a child, that her father Thomas Carter had been a carpenter and sometime farmer who had a genius for growing things and a total inability to manage money, that her mother had been the practical one who kept the family afloat until she died of a fever when Celia was 17. He learned that Celia had educated herself largely, with a mixed bag of books that had followed the family from Mississippi to Texas, and that she read everything she could get her hands on. He learned that she had a dry, precise sense of humor that she deployed quietly and without fanfare, and that she was capable of a kind of directness that he found deeply refreshing. She learned that he had grown up doing his father's bidding on the Travis County ranch, that he had never entirely been at peace with the way his father operated but had not known how to name it until he was older, that he was a competent horseman and a passable carpenter, and that he preferred dogs to cats and mornings to evenings and silence to noise. You have not asked me if I have a husband, she said at some point, and he looked up from his coffee. No, he agreed. Most men would have asked that first, she said. It didn't seem like the most important question, he said. Though if you do, I imagine he would have had something to say about the fence situation. I don't, she said. I was engaged once before my father died. He left when the land trouble started. He did not think the land was worth the difficulty. She said it without particular bitterness, as a factual report on a person who had shown himself to be less than he appeared. He was wrong, Jacob said. Yes, she said. He was. They rode to Victoria 2 days later, which was a full day's ride, and Jacob hired a second horse at the Sparrow Creek livery, because he was not about to have Celia Carter ride behind him side saddle for 30 miles, a suggestion which she received with a look that told him she had not considered any other arrangement. They rode side by side on the long flat road, talking intermittently and comfortable in the silences between, and Jacob became aware somewhere along the way that this was the most at ease he had felt in another person's company in a considerable time. Samuel Prout turned out to be a small, precise man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate manner of someone who had spent a career translating complicated situations into manageable steps. He looked at the deed for a long time without speaking, and then he looked at Jacob and then at Celia. "Miss Carter," he said, "this is a properly executed and recorded deed. Where has it been for the past 3 years?" she told him. He listened with the expression of a man who was not surprised but was angry, which Jacob respected. "The good news," Prout said, "is that this document is valid and your title to that property is clear. The bad news is that we need to establish clearly in the county record that this deed exists and is in your possession, because I am certain that whoever has been pressuring you has filed, or is planning to file some kind of competing claim." He spent the better part of the next 2 hours working, drafting a notarized statement from Jacob describing where and how the deed had been found, preparing a formal filing to re-register Celia's ownership with the county clerk, and writing 3 letters, one to the county sheriff, one to the land registrar, and one to a colleague in Houston who Prout said had experience with land fraud cases. When they left his office, the late afternoon light was golden and long on the streets of Victoria, and Celia Carter stood on the sidewalk and looked at the papers in her hand and breathed. "It's not over," she said. "No," Jacob agreed, "but it's further along than it was yesterday." She looked at him sideways. "How long can you stay?" He thought about Travis County and his father's house and the work waiting for him there. He thought about Captain in the livery and the roads he knew and did not know, and the way this woman's face looked in the late afternoon light, serious and private and more beautiful than he had any business noticing. "I don't have any reason I need to be somewhere else immediately," he said carefully. "Good," she said, "because I think I would like the help." And then she ruined it by adding, with complete practicality, "I need someone to help me restack that firewood before the first frost." He laughed, and it came out more warmly than he expected, and she looked at him with something curious and alive in those gray eyes. They stayed the night at a proper boarding house in Victoria, in separate rooms, and rode back to Sparrow Creek the next morning. Jacob restacked the firewood. He repaired a loose board on the barn roof. He helped her move the remaining corn stubble so the field could rest properly over winter. They worked alongside each other with a natural efficiency that surprised neither of them as much as it should have, and in the evenings they sat on the porch with their coffee and watched the stars come up over the coastal plains and talked about everything and nothing. The trouble, when it came on a Thursday evening 10 days after Jacob's arrival. He was in the barn with Captain when he heard hoofbeats on the lane, multiple horses moving with the deliberate pace of men who have a purpose. He came out of the barn and saw 3 riders coming up toward the house, and his hand went to the revolver at his hip before he had consciously decided anything. Celia was on the porch and she had her shotgun, and she was watching the riders come with the stillness of a woman who has been waiting for this. The riders pulled up in the yard. The man in front was broad and self-satisfied in the way of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he looked first at Jacob, with poorly concealed surprise, and then at Celia. "Miss Carter," he said, as though they were meeting at a social occasion, "we've come to make you a final offer on this property. Our company is prepared to be generous." "I'm not selling," she said. The man smiled. "I think you may want to reconsider. Things have a way of becoming quite difficult for a woman alone out here." "She's not alone," Jacob said. The man looked at him with the careful assessment of someone weighing a threat. "And who are you?" "My name is Jacob Hadley. My father was Elias Hadley of Travis County. I believe you may have known him." A small change moved across the man's face, the briefest flicker of something, whether it was recognition or alarm or recalculation, Jacob could not tell. "Are you Rufus Cole?" Jacob asked. The man straightened in his saddle. "I am." "Then you know exactly what I'm talking about," Jacob said, "because I found the deed that you took from this woman, and it's been filed with the county clerk in Calhoun County." And there is a sworn affidavit sitting with a lawyer in Victoria right now that tells exactly where it was found and who held it and for how long. So if your company has any legal claim to file on this property, I suggest you take it to court, because Miss Carter will meet you there." Rufus Cole looked at Jacob for a long moment, and then at Celia, and then back at Jacob. The two men with him shifted in their saddles. "Your father and I had an arrangement," Cole said quietly. "My father is dead," Jacob said, "and his arrangements died with him. It was very quiet in the yard. The cow moved somewhere in the pasture. A night bird called once from the live oaks." Cole looked at Celia one more time, and whatever calculation he was making behind those flat eyes appeared to resolve against his earlier position. "This isn't over," he said. "You said that to me when you took my deed," Celia replied. "I have it back now." Cole turned his horse and rode out, and his men followed, and the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the dark. Celia let out a breath and set the shotgun barrel down against the porch railing. She sat on the top step and pressed her hands together between her knees. Jacob came up and sat beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. "He'll try something else," she said. "Maybe," Jacob said, "but Pruitt's letters went out. And Cole knows now that there are people who know what happened. Men like that operate best in the dark." She nodded. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him in the cool evening air, and he was acutely aware of it. "Jacob," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him with those direct gray eyes in the moonlight, and he realized that whatever she was about to say was something she had been working up to, something she had organized and examined before she spoke, the way she did everything. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done," she said. "I don't think there are words that are sufficient. You didn't have to come. You didn't have to stay. Everything you've done since you got here has been more than could be expected of any person, let alone someone who owed me nothing." "I owed you something," he said. "My father owed you something." "You are not your father," she said firmly. "Don't conflate those two things." He looked at her. The moonlight made a silver edge along her profile, and the loose strands of her hair moved a little in the night breeze, and Jacob felt something moving in him that was quite distinct from obligation. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." They sat there on the steps for a long time, with the October night settling around them, and neither of them said what was becoming obvious, because they were both careful people who did not act rashly on gut feelings. But the feeling was there, undeniable and warm and quietly insistent, and Jacob thought that if he sat next to this woman on this porch step for the rest of his life, he would not find that an unreasonable way to spend his time. The next morning brought a letter from Samuel Pruitt's office, delivered by the boy from the general store on a sweating horse, that contained news that resolved at least one strand of the trouble. Pruitt had heard back from his colleague in Houston. Rufus Cole's land company was being investigated for 3 separate cases of deed fraud in different counties, and the documentation from Jacob and Celia's case had been forwarded to the state land commissioner's office in Austin. It would take time, Pruitt wrote, but the net was closing around Cole's operation, and his leverage over the Carter property had essentially dissolved. Celia read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. 3 cases, she said. 3 other people. At least, Jacob said. He did this to other people, to other women maybe, or families, who did not have someone ride to their door with the missing piece. She was quiet a moment. "I was lucky, Jacob. I was fortunate in a way that has nothing to do with what I deserve. Other people were not." He could hear what was in that, the weight of it, the moral seriousness of a woman who could not accept a good outcome without measuring it against the people who had not gotten one. "You can give your testimony to the state investigator," he said, "when the time comes, and Pruitt can make sure the other cases are connected properly. You won't be able to undo what Cole did, but you can help make sure he can't do it again." She looked at him, and for a moment her composure slipped just enough that he could see the relief underneath it, the deep bone-level relief of someone who has been holding on a loan for a very long time and is being told that the holding might be over soon. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. She asked it simply, without any particular inflection, but he knew exactly what the question carried. "Do you want me to?" he asked. She considered that for a moment with the careful honesty he had come to recognize as fundamental to her character. "No," she said. "I don't." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll need to ride back to Travis County," he said, and her face shifted almost imperceptibly before he finished the sentence. "I have my father's house to settle and some affairs to put in order. That will take a couple of weeks." She waited. "And then," he said, "if you're open to it, I would like to come back." She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and then she said, "What would you come back for, Jacob Hadley?" And he said, "For you, Celia Carter, with your permission." The directness of it surprised her. He could see that, and she was quiet long enough that he wondered if he had misjudged badly. But then her mouth curved in that genuine, reluctant smile that he had come to understand was the most honest thing about her. "With my permission," she repeated. "Yes, all right." She paused. "Come back then." He rode back to Travis County the next morning, and the 3 days' ride felt very different from the 3 days he had ridden to reach her. He spent it thinking about things with unusual clarity, about what he wanted and what he was willing to do to get there, about what a life looked like when it was pointing in the right direction. He thought about Celia Carter's face in the morning light over her kitchen table, and the way she held her shotgun, and the dry edge in her voice when she was being funny, and the way she had looked at the deed when he first showed it to her on the porch, with that raw, barely controlled tide of emotion. He settled his father's estate as efficiently as he could, selling the Travis County property to a neighboring rancher who had been after it for years, and who paid a fair price without much negotiation. He hired a lawyer in Austin to make sure everything was properly documented, which took longer than he wanted it to, but was worth the time. He wrote a letter to Celia, because 2 weeks was a long time and he wanted her to know that he had not changed his mind. She wrote back. Her letter was brief and formal and told him about the progress of the Prout investigation and the state investigator's visit to Sparrow Creek, and the fact that Tom Aldridge from up the road had helped her fix the north pasture fence that she had been unable to get to. And at the very end, in the same careful script that had written her address on the back of the deed, she had added, "I am glad you are coming back." He was on the road before the letter had been back in his hand for 5 minutes. He arrived at the Cedar Post gate in the early afternoon of a November day, with the sky a sharp cold blue overhead and the coastal grasses bent flat in the south wind. He could see smoke from the kitchen stove rising from the chimney of the house, and the milk cow in the pasture, and the chickens picking their way across the yard. The fence he had repaired stood solid in the afternoon light, and the firewood was properly stacked against the barn wall where he had left it. She came out onto the porch when she heard Captain on the lane, and she stood there in her blue work dress with her hair loose around her shoulders for once, and she shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun and watched him ride up. He dismounted at the porch steps and looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "I know," she said. "I believed you, I just wanted to say it." He smiled. "Celia." "Yes." "I have been thinking for 3 weeks now about what I want to say when I got back here, and I want to say it now before I lose my nerve, which is a thing that is more likely than you might suppose because I am generally a cautious person." She watched him with careful attention. "I am in love with you," he said, "or becoming so rapidly, and the distinction is fine enough that I don't think it matters. I would like to court you properly, and with the intention of asking you to marry me, and I thought you should know that before we went any further because you deserve to know what you would be agreeing to if you let me stay." She was very quiet. "That is all I had prepared," he said. "The rest I was going to improvise depending on how this part landed." Celia Carter came down the 2 porch steps and stood in front of him in the thin November sunshine, and she looked at him with those steady gray eyes that had leveled him from the first moment on the porch, and she said, "Jacob Hadley, you rode 3 days to return something that was mine when you could have left it in the Strongbox and no one would have known. You stayed and fixed my fence and rode with me to the lawyer and stood in my yard and faced down Rufus Cole. I have been thinking about you for 3 weeks. And, he said, and, she said, court me then. He courted her through November and into December, riding the 3 days from the small rented room he had taken in Hallettsville to spend time at her farm, and then back again, and then forward again, and the riding came to feel less like a journey and more like a pulse, the regular rhythm of something that was becoming a life. He met Tom Aldridge, her neighbor, who was a large, taciturn man in his 60s who shook Jacob's hand once and said simply, "She's the best neighbor I've had in 20 years," which Jacob understood as both a compliment to Celia and a warning to himself, and which he received in that spirit. He met Reverend Marsh, who was a thoughtful man with the kind of eyes that have seen too much to be easily fooled, and who watched Jacob and Celia together with quiet assessment for one Sunday morning service, before telling Jacob afterward that he thought highly of Celia Carter and hoped Jacob understood what he was getting, which was a woman of exceptional quality and considerable backbone. "I know exactly what I'm getting," Jacob said. "That's why I'm here." Reverend Marsh had smiled and said that was the right answer. He helped Celia with the farm, as he had promised, through the fall and into winter. There was always work to do, the kind of continuous necessary labor that a farm requires, and Jacob understood that labor and was not resentful of it. He rechinked the barn walls against the coming cold. He repaired a section of the house roof where water had gotten in. He helped her lay in the winter supplies, driving the wagon to town and back, and he fixed the stove's flue pipe which had been drawing poorly and causing smoke problems. In the evenings they read, because Celia was a reader and had made him so, loaning him volumes from her shelf, and asking him about them afterward with the incisive curiosity of someone who uses other people's opinions as a way of understanding them better. He read things he had never read before, and enjoyed most of them and said so, and told her honestly when he did not understand something, and she explained without condescension and asked him what he thought, not what he was supposed to think. He fell entirely, irreversibly in love with her somewhere around the middle of December, on an afternoon when a north wind had come through, and it was too cold to work outside and they sat by the stove with books and the wind made the house creak, and she read him a passage from a novel that she said reminded her of him. And when he looked over at her, she did not look up from the page but she was smiling, and the firelight was in her hair, and he thought this is what I have been missing every day of my life, until now, and did not know how to name it. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in January, standing in her kitchen with the coffee hot on the stove and the winter sun coming in the window and making everything look like gold. He did it without elaboration or performance, going down on one knee on her clean-swept kitchen floor and looking up at her with everything he felt completely visible in his face, because he had decided that whatever else he was going to be, he was not going to be a man who hid things from Celia Carter. "Celia," he said, "will you marry me and let me help you build something here? I don't have my father's property to offer you, but I have myself and my work and everything I am, and I want to spend it alongside you." She looked down at him for a moment with her hands clasped together and her face serious and alive with feeling, and then she said, "Yes, Jacob, get up off that floor. Yes." He stood up and she took his face in both her hands and looked at him with those gray eyes very close and said, "I love you, I should say that. I have been slow to say it because I am not naturally quick with those words, but I want you to know it." "I know it," he said, "but I'm glad to hear it." He kissed her, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular clean smell of her hair, and outside the January wind pushed at the windows without getting in. They were married in March of 1883, at the small church in Sparrow Creek, with Reverend Marsh officiating and Tom Aldridge standing as witness and the boy from the general store, whose name turned out to be William, sitting in the front pew looking solemn and important. Samuel Prout sent a letter of congratulation, and the news that Rufus Cole had been charged formally with 5 counts of deed fraud by the state of Texas, and that Cole's land company had been dissolved by order of the court, and that 3 other families whose properties had been encumbered by Cole's schemes had recovered their clear title. The letter arrived the morning of the wedding, and Celia read it at the kitchen table in her wedding dress, which was a blue the color of the coastal sky, and cried for the first time since Jacob had met her. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her cry without moving toward her immediately, because he had learned that she needed a moment to gather herself before she wanted comfort, and then he moved to the table and sat beside her and put his hand over hers. "Those families got their land back," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's good," she said. "That's very good." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in the unsentimental way she did everything. "I'm going to need to wash my face again before we go to the church." "We have time," he said. "I'm glad it's settled," she said. "I wanted it settled before we started." "I know," he said. They went to the church, and they were married, and the small congregation of Sparrow Creek witnessed it with the warmth of a community that had been watching Celia Carter hold her ground alone for years, and was glad to see her something other than alone. Several of the women brought food to the supper afterward at the church hall, and Tom Aldridge made a toast that was short and gruff and genuinely moving, and William from the general store ate 3 pieces of cake and fell asleep under a bench. Jacob and Celia rode home together in the early evening, through the live oaks with the Spanish moss hanging in the branches, and the first spring wildflowers beginning to show along the road edges. She rode beside him as she always did, not behind him, her horse moving easily in the fading light. "Well, Mrs. Hadley," he said. She tried it on for a moment. "That's strange," she said. "Good strange." "We could do it Carter Hadley if you prefer," he said. She considered. "Hadley is fine," she said. "My mother's name was Carter too, and I carry that wherever I go. The name isn't the thing." "What's the thing?" he asked. She looked at him across the space between their horses, and the late light was in her eyes and all around her, and she said, "The thing is that this is mine, and now it's ours, and I chose that." She paused. "I need things to be chosen, not happen to me. Chosen." "I know," he said, "and I did choose it. I would choose it again every morning." They settled into the life of the farm with the natural efficiency of 2 people who have been cooperating long enough that the work has found its own rhythm. Jacob had sold the Travis County property for a fair sum, and they used part of it to hire hands for the spring planting season. 2 brothers from a farming family in town who knew the coastal soil and worked hard and treated Celia with the simple respect that she had always deserved. They broke the north field and planted it with corn and sorghum, and put the kitchen garden in properly, and Jacob bought a second milk cow and 6 more laying hens, and the farm began to feel like a going concern rather than a survival exercise. Jacob also filed a formal complaint with the State Land Commissioner's office, giving full testimony about the Strongbox and the deed and his father's involvement with Cole. It was not a comfortable thing to do, to put on record in an official document that your own father had participated in fraud. But Celia had sat across the table from him the night before he rode to the county seat to make the filing and said simply, "You're not your father. Telling the truth about what he did doesn't change who you are. It demonstrates it." And so he had gone and told the truth, and felt afterward not lighter exactly, but cleaner. Elias Hadley had held no formal stake in Cole's operation, it turned out. He had been more of a repository, a holding place for documents that needed to disappear temporarily, compensated in small ways for the inconvenience. It was small and mean, and suited exactly what Jacob knew of his father, and it was on record now, and Jacob did not intend to spend the rest of his life in the shadow of it. The spring came in warmly and abundantly, the way coastal Texas springs do, with every kind of wildflower appearing along the roads and in the field margins, and the air smelling like rain and new growth, and the whole flat country looking improbably lovely in the long evening light. Celia walked her fields in the mornings before the heat of the day, checking the young corn plants the way her father had taught her, assessing the moisture in the soil and the color of the leaves with the practical knowledge of someone who grew up watching this being done, and then had to learn it properly herself. Jacob watched her sometimes from the porch, his coffee in his hand, and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost unfamiliar. This was what it was supposed to look like, he thought. A woman who knew her own land. A life that had been honestly built and honestly maintained. Something to protect not because you had taken it but because it was genuinely yours. He discovered, that spring, that he was also genuinely good at farming in this particular soil and this particular climate, which was different enough from the hill country where he had grown up that he had to learn it fresh, and found the learning interesting. He and Celia talked about the land constantly, in the way that people who love a piece of ground talk about it, as a living thing with a character and preferences and potential. They argued sometimes about the best approach to a particular problem, and neither of them gave ground without a fight, and they were both usually right enough that the arguing was productive. They were very happy. In the late summer of 1883, Celia told Jacob that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, sitting across the table from him, the way she had sat across from him on the first morning he was ever in that kitchen. And she delivered the news with the particular combination of certainty and careful attention to his reaction that he had come to understand as her way of sharing important things. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and said nothing for a moment, because there was too much to say and the most important part of it was already in his face and she could see it. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but that seems to be normal." "We'll get more help," he said. "You shouldn't be doing the heavy work." "I've been doing the heavy work by myself for 4 years," she said. "Celia." "Jacob." They looked at each other. "A little more help," she conceded. "I will accept that." He rode to Tom Aldridge's place that afternoon to share the news because Tom Aldridge had become something between a friend and a father to him, the taciturn way and all, and Tom's face rearranged itself into something Jacob had never seen there before, which was open delight. "Good," Tom said. "That's very good. That farm needs a generation." The boy was born in the spring of 1884, on an April morning when the bluebonnets were at their peak, loud and blue and insistent along every roadside. He was named Thomas Jacob Hadley, Thomas for Celia's father who had built that farm and loved that ground, and Jacob because Celia said she wanted the child to grow up knowing who his father was from the very first moment he could understand his own name. Thomas Jacob was a large, healthy, obstinate baby who expressed his opinions clearly and at considerable volume, and who looked, Celia said, disconcertingly like his father, which Jacob took as a compliment. Reverend Marsh christened him in the Sparrow Creek Church on a Sunday in May, with Tom Aldridge standing as godfather, and the same small congregation who had watched his parents marry watching him be welcomed into the community with the straightforward warmth of small-town Texas. William from the general store, who was 14 now and had grown several inches, presented the baby with a bag of peppermints, which was both inappropriate and so perfectly William that Celia received it with a genuine laugh. The farm continued to grow and prosper in the quiet, honest way of good land well managed. Jacob put in an irrigation channel the second year that improved the North Field considerably, working alongside the 2 farmhands and Tom Aldridge on a project that Tom claimed to have no interest in, and then showed up at every morning without being asked. Celia expanded the kitchen garden substantially and began selling the surplus at the monthly market in town, which brought in enough extra income to finance a new section of fencing along the east pasture. The deed itself, the one that had been in the Strongbox and had come to Jacob on a Tuesday morning in October and set all of this in motion, was framed. Celia had done it herself, with a simple wooden frame that Jacob had made for her, and it hung on the wall of the house near the front door, not in the place of the sampler her mother had made, which was in the parlor but beside it. Two things that mattered on the same wall: the sampler that said "This ground is mine," and the document that proved it. People who visited sometimes asked about the framed document, and Celia would tell them, with the quiet economy of someone who has told a story often enough to know which parts matter, about how her father built the farm, and how the deed had been taken, and how a man she had never met had found it in a locked box and ridden 3 days through the Texas countryside to put it back in her hands. And then she would look at Jacob with the particular expression that he privately thought of as her real face, the one she did not show many people, but had shown him progressively more of since the January morning he went down on one knee on her kitchen floor. Jacob always received this look with more gratitude than he could easily express, and he had tried several times to express it in the evenings, when Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet and they sat on the porch in whatever season it happened to be, and Celia had become accustomed to listening to him try. "You look at me like I did something remarkable," he said one evening, a warm evening in late summer when Thomas was 2 years old and asleep inside, and the katydids were loud in the live oaks, and the sky over the gulf was doing something extraordinary with orange and purple. "You did," she said. "I returned your property," he said. "Anyone decent would have done the same." "Most people are not that decent," she said, "and no one else did." He thought about that. "It was the right thing to do." "Yes," she agreed. "But you also stayed, and that was a choice, not an obligation." He looked at her. She was sitting sideways on the porch swing he had installed the previous spring, with her feet tucked up beneath her the way she did in private moments, and the evening light was kind on her face, and the 2 years of their marriage and the year of their son and everything they had built together was in her expression in a way that made his chest tight. "Best choice I ever made," he said. She leaned forward and took his hand with both of hers, and she turned it over and looked at it for a moment. This hand she knew well by now, and she said, "I love you, Jacob Hadley." I said it slowly the first time, and I have said it every day since, and I will say it every day after this, and it is never less true than the day before. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, and she let him, and the katydids kept on, and the sky kept changing over the gulf, and Thomas made a small sleeping sound from somewhere inside the house, and they both turned toward it automatically, and then looked back at each other and smiled. The second child was another boy, born in 1886, and they named him William, partly for the boy from the general store who was by then 18 and working behind the counter himself, and was a fixture in their lives, and partly because Celia said she liked the sound of it. William Carter Hadley was smaller than his brother at birth, but made up for it with velocity, moving faster by 8 months than Thomas had at a year, and climbing things before Jacob was prepared for that development. Thomas, at 2 and then 3, regarded his brother with the complex proprietary interest of a firstborn child, simultaneously annoyed by the competition and invested in teaching William things. It was Thomas who taught William to say Captain's name, because Jacob's roan horse was still going strong at 16 and was Thomas's particular favorite, and he considered it essential that his brother learn to appreciate Captain properly. Jacob watched his sons in the barn one afternoon, Thomas conducting a very serious introduction of William to Captain, the horse tolerating it with the ancient patience of a horse who has seen everything, and he felt the weight of everything that had brought them here. The strongbox and the deed and the 3-day ride, and the woman on the porch with the shotgun. All of it pressing down in the best possible way, the way that good things press down, reminding you of the gravity of what you have been given. He told Celia about it at supper, the way the afternoon had looked, the boys in the barn, and she listened with her chin in her hand and the lamplight on her face and the expression that told him she was really listening. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "how different it would have been if you had left the deed in the box. If you had assumed someone else would deal with it, or that it was none of your business. If I had not opened the door that morning," she was quiet, "I would have lost the farm eventually." They would have found another way. Without the deed, I had nothing to prove what was mine. I know, he said, and Thomas and William would not exist, she said, and this life would not exist, and you would be somewhere else entirely. I would have been somewhere worse, he said simply and without drama because it was true. She smiled at him. Yes, she said, you would have been somewhere worse. In 1880, Seven Prout wrote to tell them that Rufus Cole had been convicted on 3 of the 5 counts and sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary in Huntsville. The other 2 cases had been settled by civil judgment, and the families involved had been awarded damages. It was not complete justice, because it never entirely is, but it was real and documented and final, and it meant that Cole would not be in a position to do this to anyone else for some considerable time. Celia read the letter aloud at the supper table, because Thomas was 5 by then, and she had decided early that her children would not be kept away from the real business of life. Thomas listened with the solemn attention of a boy who understood more than he could articulate. "Is the bad man going to come back?" Thomas asked with the directness of 5-year-old logic. "No," Celia said. "He's been put where he can't bother anyone." "Because Papa stopped him," Thomas said. Jacob and Celia looked at each other across the table. "Because the law stopped him," Celia said carefully. "And because your father helped make sure the law had what it needed to do that." Thomas considered this and then returned to his supper, satisfied, because at 5 years old the distinction between Papa stopped him and the law stopped him with Papa's help was essentially the same thing, and Jacob suspected he was not wrong. Samuel Prout, who had been their lawyer and in some ways their guardian through the whole long process, came to visit that fall, making the trip from Victoria with a genuine interest in seeing how the Carter Hadley farm was getting on. He was getting on in years now, slower than he had been, with more gray in his hair, and he walked the farm with Jacob in the October afternoon and looked at the corn stubble and the fencing and the improved barn and the kitchen garden that Celia had expanded to nearly half an acre. "She was determined to keep this place," Prout said, "even before you showed up. She came to see me twice in the year before you arrived, asking if there was any avenue available to her without the deed. There was not, but she kept looking." Jacob nodded. He knew this about her, the tenacity, the refusal to accept an obstacle as a permanent condition rather than a temporary problem to be worked around. "She'll do the same for the boys," Prout said. "Teach them that you dig in when it matters." "She already is," Jacob said. They walked back to the house where Celia was on the porch with both boys, Thomas doing something industrious with sticks in the yard and William sitting in her lap chewing on a wooden spoon that he had apparently acquired from the kitchen for this purpose. She looked up when the men came through the gate and smiled, and Prout looked at that smile and then at Jacob. "Well," Prout said, with the satisfaction of a man watching something he helped make possible running exactly as it should. "Yes." The farm continued on through the seasons the way that good farms do, with the rhythm of planting and harvest and mending and waiting and beginning again. Jacob and Celia found the years had a different texture than either of them had expected when they were young, not the grinding accumulation of difficulty that both of them had known before, but something more layered and interesting, a life that had its hardships and disappointments but was, at its foundation, genuinely sound. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's quietness, and showed an early aptitude for the land that made both his parents feel something complicated, because it meant he might stay on the farm and continue it, and they wanted that, and also they wanted him to have every freedom. They discussed it on the porch in the evenings and agreed that the best thing they could do was make sure he had enough education to choose, and that whatever he chose, they would not make it difficult. William, smaller and faster and louder than his brother, showed an equal aptitude for getting into situations that required explanation, and a gift for animals that manifested in the way Captain followed him around the corral as though William had something important to offer, which Jacob found both endearing and slightly suspicious. Captain was now 20 years old and had earned his pastoral retirement, and spent his days in the small corral eating good grass, and allowing the boys to lean on him. In the evenings, when the boys were in bed and the farm was quiet, and the coastal sky was doing its patient work overhead, Jacob and Celia sat on the porch swing he had built in the first year of their marriage, which had been replaced twice since then as the wood wore out, and they talked, or they were silent, in the easy, complete way of people who have been through real things together and found each other sufficient for all of it. They talked about the old days sometimes, the way the deed had looked in his hands in that Travis County kitchen, and the morning on the porch when she had held the shotgun and told him to show her what he had, and the ride to Victoria and the lawyer's office, and the long weeks when the outcome was still uncertain. They talked about it the way people talk about the thing that changed everything, not constantly, but with the quiet reverence of people who understand that the hinge moment of their lives was also improbable, and that they are living in the good luck of it. "If I had not opened that Strongbox," Jacob said once, on a spring evening when the bluebonnets were blooming along the lane and Thomas was 7 and William was 4, and the farm was in full working order around them and everything was very good. "You would have opened it eventually," Celia said. "You're too thorough not to." "Maybe not the same morning. Maybe not," she agreed. "But you would have found it. And maybe I would have left it," he said. "Left it for someone else to deal with, or assumed my father must have had a reason." She was quiet for a moment. "But you didn't," she said. "That's what happened. You didn't." He thought about that. The version of himself that had left the deed in the box. That man's life would have been straightforward and smaller and fine, probably, in all the ordinary ways. And Celia's would have been diminished, ground down, eventually ended here. And Thomas and William would not exist, and this porch swing and the sound of the coastal night and all of it. "No," he said, "I didn't." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not often do in daylight or in company, but did regularly in the evenings when the boys were asleep and the world had contracted to the size of their porch. He put his arm around her and felt her weight against him, easy and real and complete. "I'm glad you were thorough," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "I'm glad you opened your door." "I almost didn't," she said. "I heard the horse on the lane and I thought it was Cole's men back again. I nearly went out the back." He had not known this. "What made you open it?" She was quiet for a moment. "You knocked," she said. "Cole's men never knocked." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the evening was very gentle around them, the way Texas evenings can be in the spring when the air is still warm from the afternoon and hasn't gone cold yet, and the mockingbirds are making their complicated noise in the live oaks, and the whole flat coastal world smells like salt and wildflowers and new growth. In 1890, they added a proper parlor to the house, expanding it beyond the modest footprint Celia's father had built, because the boys needed more room and they had earned more room, and there was enough to do it properly. Jacob did most of the carpentry himself, with the help of the farm hands and Tom Aldridge, who showed up without being asked on the first day and stayed through the whole project, directing operations with the authority of a man who had been building things in Calhoun County since before Jacob was born. Celia designed the parlor herself, with the bookshelf running the full length of one wall, because the books had multiplied considerably over the years and had been living in stacks on every available surface, and with a window looking east toward the Gulf so that the morning light would come in at the best angle. When the room was finished, she moved the sampler her mother had made onto the new wall, where it looked at home immediately, and she moved the framed deed beside it. They stood together in the new room on the evening it was finished, the smell of new lumber around them and the boys running through it with the uninhibited joy of children encountering extra space, and Celia looked at the two framed things on the wall and was quiet for a moment. "My mother made that sampler because she wanted me to know that what you own is worth fighting for," she said. "And your father's box gave me back the proof that I owned it because you decided that was the right thing to do." She paused. "It's a strange thing, the chain of it, how one decision touches everything else." "My decision," he said, "was the easy part. The hard part was everything you did for 3 years before I showed up. She looked at him. You always say that, because it's always true. She took his hand. Then we'll say this instead. We both did the hard part, and then we did the rest together. She squeezed his hand once, firm and warm. That's the true version. That's the true version, he agreed. Thomas wandered through the new room and stopped in front of the framed deed and looked at it with the assessing eyes of a 9-year-old who had heard the story many times and was never tired of it. Papa, he said without looking away from the document, when you found that paper and came down to give it back to Mama, were you scared? Jacob considered this honestly. A little, he said. I didn't know what I would find when I got here or how she would receive me. Thomas thought about this. But you came anyway. Yes. Because it was the right thing. Yes. Thomas looked at the deed for another moment. Then he looked up at Jacob with his mother's serious gray eyes. I want to be like that, he said. When something is right, just do it, even if you don't know how it will turn out. The room was very quiet except for William banging on something in the far corner with what appeared to be a wooden block. Jacob looked at his son, and at the deed on the wall, and at Celia standing beside him with their son's words still in the air between them, and he felt the full weight of everything that had come from a locked box and a 3-day ride and a knock on a door. Everything that was in this room and on these walls and in the faces of his children and in the warmth of his wife's hand in his. Yes, he said to Thomas, exactly like that. The farm stood on that black coastal soil for all the years that came after, through the seasons and the changes that the last years of the 19th century brought to Texas and to the country at large. Jacob and Celia Hadley grew old together with the gradual, honest dailiness of two people who have chosen each other in full understanding and found the choice continues to be good. Their arguments were real and sometimes loud and always resolved, because Celia had no patience for unresolved arguments and Jacob had learned early that she was usually right and that the times she wasn't were worth the conversation to find out. Tom Aldridge died in 1892 and Jacob and Celia were at his side, and Thomas, at 11, helped carry the coffin and said afterward that Tom had been the kind of man he wanted to be, which was large and quiet and absolutely reliable, and Jacob thought that was about as good an obituary as a man could want. Tom had left his farm to his nephew in San Antonio, and the nephew came and introduced himself and turned out to be a decent man who kept the Aldridge farm going and became in time a neighbor in the full sense that Tom had been. Captain died that same year, at 26 years old, which was a remarkable age for a horse and not surprising given that he had been treated for the last years of his life as something between a livestock animal and a household member. William, who was 9, cried with the wholehearted grief of a child who has not yet learned to contain himself, and Jacob let him cry and did not tell him it was excessive, because it was not excessive, and because some things deserve to be grieved fully. They buried Captain in the corner of the pasture near the live oaks, and Jacob built a small wooden marker for the spot, because Thomas asked him to and because it seemed right. The grave of a good horse on good ground. There were worse monuments. William turned to his brother's old horses after that, and then to breeding horses in a small way, which turned into a larger way over the following years as it became apparent that William had a genuine gift for it that went beyond affection and into something close to science. By the time he was 17, he was corresponding with a horse breeder in San Antonio who had heard of his results, which was the sort of development that causes parents to feel simultaneously proud and slightly bewildered, because the child is becoming something you could not have entirely predicted. Thomas, true to his earliest inclinations, stayed close to the land. He learned the farm from the ground up with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and by the time he was 16, he was making decisions about the rotation and the irrigation that Jacob deferred to with genuine confidence. The farm expanded in small, careful increments, always within what they could properly manage, never overreaching. Celia continued to walk her fields in the mornings. She continued to read everything she could get her hands on. She continued to sit on the porch with Jacob in the evenings and watch the stars come up over the coastal plain and talk about whatever presented itself, which was everything. She continued to hold her ground on every matter where she believed she was right, and to acknowledge cleanly when she was wrong, and to treat every person she encountered with the precise degree of respect that their actions had earned rather than their position claimed. She was, in short, exactly who she had been on the porch that October morning with the shotgun in her hands, and those gray eyes leveled at a stranger who said he had something that belonged to her. The years had added warmth and ease to it, the particular softening that comes from being genuinely loved for a long time, but the fundamental person was unchanged, and Jacob had never found any reason to wish for that. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, which fell in March of 1893, they sat on the porch in the mild weather with the wildflowers coming up along the lane and the two boys doing something noisy in the barn, and Celia poured them each a small glass of the whiskey that they kept for special occasions, and she looked at Jacob with the particular expression that was entirely her own and said, 10 years. 10 years, he agreed. She looked out at the lane and the wildflowers and the live oaks and the good fencing that ran along the pasture edge, where the old fence had once been torn down and thrown in a pile. She looked at all of it for a moment, her farm, her ground, the thing her father had built and she had fought for, and that was now also the place where her children were growing up in the knowledge that this land was theirs. "Do you know what I thought that first morning?" she said. "When you stood in the lane and told me you had something that was mine, what did you think?" "I thought you were another one of Cole's men," she said, "come to try a different approach. And then you said your name and I thought, I don't know this name, and then you held up the deed and I thought, that is my deed, and then I thought, this cannot be real, and then I thought, but it is. And then you told me to come up on the porch," he said, "with the shotgun on me." "I was not going to put the shotgun down," she said with dignity. "I did not ask you to," he said. She smiled, and it was the real one, the full one that she had shown him progressively more freely over the years. "And then you came into my kitchen and you sat at my table and you told me the truth about your father and what you found, and I thought, this is a man who tells the truth even when it costs him something. And that was when I started to think that you might be exactly what you appeared to be." "Was that enough?" he asked. "At that point," she considered. "It was enough to let you fix my fence," she said. "The rest took a little longer." He laughed. She laughed with him, and the evening was easy around them. And the sound of the boys arguing about something in the barn was the uncomplicated background sound of a life that was full and well-made and real. The deed hung on the wall inside, behind them, in the parlor with the good morning light coming in the east window. Thomas Carter's name on it and Celia Carter's name on it, and the date March 14th, 1879, and the description of 160 acres in Calhoun County, Texas, recorded and witnessed and filed and refiled and put into the permanent record of the county in a way that no one was ever going to unseat again. The sampler beside it in its careful cross-stitch. "This ground is mine." And beyond the porch, the farm itself, with its fields and its fences and its barn and its kitchen garden and the grave of a good horse in the corner of the pasture, and two boys growing up in the knowledge of where they came from and what it meant, and a man and a woman who had found each other at the intersection of a wrong and its repair, and had built something honest and enduring from that beginning. Jacob Hadley reached over and took his wife's hand on the porch swing as the evening settled in around them, and the stars began to show above the coastal plain, and the wild spring night made its patient sounds in every direction. She laced her fingers through his without looking over, the easy habit of 10 years, and they sat in the fine dark together, two people on their own ground, with everything they had fought for and built and chosen surrounding them on all sides, permanent and good. The mockingbirds began in the live oaks, running through their catalog of every sound they had ever heard, changing from song to song the way the light changes on the Gulf, endlessly and without effort, because that was what mockingbirds do, and because in Texas in the spring the nights are long enough for everything. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.